and welcome to the Aero Export Consultants podcast. I'm John Young, and this is The Point. Well, folks, we're through with June, but what's happened over the last 30 days is going to have lasting consequences moving forward, I don't doubt. In case anyone's still in the dark, I'm talking about Iran and what is currently being labeled the 12-Day War. Now, I'm not one to speak on matters outside of my depth, so I'll leave the military actions and broader foreign policy discussions for someone else. What I will speak on are the trade relationships and implications that arise out of events such as these, and how, of course, they will affect American industry, manufacturing, and exporting. Because we're AEC, and that's what we do. What that means today is a look at our current trade stance with Iran and refreshing you listeners on the mountain of regulations we currently have restricting and penalizing Iran. And if recent actions are any indication, this current stance is not going to change anytime soon. Of course, it's not all bad news for Iran. In a sudden move involving two of our adversaries, President Trump is signaling that he will not move against China buying Iranian oil. However, as we've seen with the recent sanctions relief targeting Syria, I think that decisions such as these will remain isolated from our main area of focus, export controls. So let's take a look at export controls and at the other regulations currently targeting Iran. Now, Iran is an embargoed country. Practically what this means is that any license application for purposes other than humanitarian reasons or the safe operation of U.S. origin aircraft will generally be denied in the EAR. No license exceptions may be used for Iran either. In addition, the Secretary of State has designated Iran as a country that has repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism, meaning that Iran as a country is controlled for reasons of anti-terrorism, adding an additional layer of prohibition against the country. In fact, no person may export or re-export any item that is subject to the EAR without an authorization from OFAC, to ensure that such an export won't infringe on some of the Treasury sanctions that our government has leveled on Iran. The Treasury Department has a comprehensive embargo against Iran, with over 24 executive orders specifically targeting Iran and a multitude of published guidances and advisories informing the American public on how to engage in transactions involving Iran, though it might be more accurate to say how not to engage in transactions involving Iran. In this refresher, I want to go over a specific guidance released in the last few years. This guidance was published through a collaboration between the Departments of Commerce, Justice, State, and Treasury, indicative of the seriousness of this subject and its current day impact. I've spoken about this situation at length before on an EIB podcast and in combination with other topics relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it deserves going over again, especially with the current level of hostility surrounding Iran and the Middle East. If you haven't caught on yet, I'm talking about drones. Iran's UAV capability has skyrocketed in recent years, and they have found a dedicated customer in Russia who has made use of Iran's inventory in its invasion of Ukraine. Since August 2022, Iran has transferred hundreds of UAVs to Russia, who has used them to strike Ukraine. The U.S. has taken serious umbrage with Iran's UAV program because, as the guidance puts it, quote, Iran's procurement, development, and proliferation of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, is an increasing threat to international peace and security. In 2022, the United States, alongside the UK and France, heavily pushed for the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which, quote, prohibits the sale, supply, or transfer to or from Iran, absent the UN Security Council's advance permission on a case-by-case basis, of items controlled by the Missile Technology Control Regime, another regime we've talked about previously. Of course, Russia is not Iran's only customer for drones. They have also provided UAVs among other weapons to the Houthis, allowing them to continue destabilizing Yemen and conduct strikes on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And if providing completed drones was not enough, according to the U.S. guidance, reports indicate that Iran has, quote, offered to provide UAV production technology and facilities to Tajikistan and Russia. With these efforts, Tehran may be seeking to strengthen bilateral relationships, boost the profits of its export sector, and complicate efforts to constrain its UAV activities through export controls and other measures. Now, export controls and other measures are where we come into this equation. According to the guidance, quote, Iran relies on foreign procurement to obtain items it cannot produce domestically, often preferring U.S. origin technologies. We've seen proof of this in reports on drone remains recovered in Ukraine. If you've listened to that specific EIB podcast episode on when export compliance fails, you'll remember what I'm referring to. UAVs recovered in Ukraine that had been launched by Russia and were comprised of American-made components. This discovery must be the result of a problem, whether in the supply chains, a lack of due diligence, negligence, malice, or all of the above. But it reveals that the burden of responsibility also includes those of us in industry who who are in a position to ensure American technology remains in responsible hands. We have an obligation, as the guidance puts it. Quote, industry should be aware of its compliance obligations due to the threat posed by the extensive overseas network of procurement agents, front companies, suppliers, and intermediaries Iran uses to obtain UAV components, all of which employ a variety of methods to evade export controls and sanctions. Industry should exercise extra vigilance due to the ubiquitous nature of many of the items, as Iran utilizes commercial-grade components in its weapons. Thankfully, the guidance does not lay out empty platitudes and leave us with them not knowing how to follow up. First, it highlights the areas of industry and specific technologies that face the most risk of being appropriated for Iran's UAV programs. First is electronics, such as transceiver modules, processors, and controllers, memories, amplifiers, and other electronic integrated circuits. Most notably, Iran relies on certain US-branded items, such as field programmable gate arrays, or FPGAs, RF transceivers, microcontrollers, and capacitors. Some of these are low-technology items and may not be included on the Commerce Control List of the EAR, i.e. they are designated as EAR 99, but nonetheless they may be controlled for export to Iran under U.S. sanctions or export controls. Next is guidance, navigation, and control equipment, such as accelerators, gyroscopes, inertial measurement units, and other navigational sensors. Finally mentioned are components, such as aircraft spark ignition and compression ignition, internal combustion piston engines, and associated spare parts and modules, such as flight computers. To break these components down further, the UAV guidance lists several HTS codes and matching product descriptions to give a more precise set of technologies to be vigilant with. The following are expressly mentioned: 840710, aircraft spark ignition reciprocating or rotatory internal combustion piston engines; 840890, compression ignition internal combustion piston engines, either diesel or semi-diesel engines, NESOI; 840910, parts for spark ignition or rotary internal combustion piston engines or compression ignition internal combustion piston engines for aircraft; 847150, processing units other than those of subheading 847.41 or 847.49, whether or not containing in the same housing one or two of the following types of unit: storage units, input units, output units; 851762, machines for the reception, conversion, and transmission or regeneration of voice images or other data, including switching and routing apparatus; 852691, radio navigational aid apparatus; 853221, tantalum capacitors; 853224, fixed capacitors, NESOI, multi-layer ceramic dielectric; 854231, processors and controllers, whether or not combined with memories, converters, logic circuits, amplifiers, clock and timing circuits, or other circuits; 854232, memories; 854233, amplifiers; 854239, other electronic integrated circuits; 854800, electrical parts of machinery or apparatus, NESOI. We've gone over many guidances concerning red flags on this podcast and over AEC and EIB's presentations in general, and this guidance is no different. As the guidance itself puts it, quote, companies such as manufacturers, distributors, resellers, and freight forwarders are often best positioned to determine whether a particular transaction or inquiry is consistent with industry norms and practices and otherwise indicates an elevated risk of sanctions or export control evasion. We are uniquely positioned to scrutinize transactions and ensure that they remain secure and that our technology does not end up in illicit hands. One of the actions we can take in furtherance of this responsibility is to examine transactions for any red flags that may arise during the process. UAV guidance provides a non-exhaustive yet comprehensive list of red flags that you and your business should be looking out for during your transactions. Listen in and think of if you've come across any of these red flags previously, and remember them for the future. Starting off, the use of corporate vehicles, i.e. legal entities, such as shell companies and legal arrangements, to obscure ownership, source of funds, or countries' entities involved, particularly sanctioned jurisdictions or restricted entities. Reluctance to share information about the end use of a product, including reluctance to complete an end-user form. Declining customary installation, training, or maintenance of the purchased item. Cyberspoofing of an email or web address to give the appearance that an illegitimate inquiry is coming from a legitimate business. Often these attempts will leverage known business relationships to lend credibility to the spoofing attempt. internet or corporate website traffic originating from IP addresses that do not correspond to a customer's reported location data. Transactions involving entities with little or no web presence. Use of personal rather than corporate email addresses. Last-minute changes to shipping instructions that appear contrary to customer history or business practices. Payment coming from a third-party country or business not listed on the end-user statement or another applicable end-user form. The use of shell companies to conduct international wire transfers, often involving financial institutions and jurisdictions distinct from company registration. Changes to standard business documents that obscure the ultimate customer. Operation of businesses using residential addresses or addresses found to be common to multiple corporate entities. Transactions involving the use of freight forwarding firms or other mail forwarding addresses listed as the product's ultimate customer address. Transactions associated with atypical shipping routes for a product and destination, or routing purchases through certain transshipment points commonly used to illegally redirect restricted items to embargoed destinations. Now, why do these red flags and sanctions reminders matter? Because recent hostilities with Iran have made it apparent in my mind that our animosity is not going away anytime soon. Therefore, a refresher in our government's ongoing efforts to deny Iran critical technology is warranted. And this extends beyond a single department of government. The guidance was a collaboration between several different departments, and while much of the guidance I referred to was export control and BIS based, the other departments have their own stringent restrictions as well. OFAC has a list of sanctions against Iran a mile long, and the ITAR labels Iran as subject to prohibition and has a policy of denial for exports of all defense articles and services. We live in turbulent times, and as such, regulations appear more volatile than they have in previous years. Case in point, look at Syria again. Sanctions lifted in what some characterize as a stunning move, a bolt from the blue and totally unexpected. As I finish writing up this episode, elsewhere there are announcements in the news about a trade deal with China. It's being described as, quote, an additional understanding of a framework to implement the Geneva Agreement, and could see restrictions lifted in areas such as rare earth minerals. There has also been mentions of China approving export applications of controlled items, and the U.S. potentially mirroring such an action. Nothing is signed or set in stone. However, it's more evidence that a great many things are both up in the air and on the table, if you'll pardon me mixing metaphors. The current administration is interested in cutting deals, and with deals come concessions. But even in the midst of a changing environment, I feel comfortable in speculating that some hard lines will remain. We can see this in Syria as well, where Treasury sanctions might have been eased, but the country remains embargoed by the Commerce Department and faces BIS and EAR restrictions. I believe we'll see more of the same even if we manage a trade deal with China. Semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, these areas are too vital to cede any ground to our largest competitor on the world stage. And like the both of them, Iran will likely also remain a subject of a hard line. Current hostilities combined with our previous stance on their activities indicates that we will not relent our pressure on Iran. Even if the coming days see peace and new deals between ourselves, Iran, and Israel, it is my view that they will not significantly impact our regime of export restrictions against the nation. So stay up to date, stay aware, stay in the know, stay vigilant when it comes to your business and your transactions, so your precious products and our American technology stays secure. And what better place to stay compliant than right here with AEC? That's all for today's episode, but remember, for all your questions and export compliance needs, contact us here at Aero Export Consultants. Research done right, compliance made simple. I'm John Young, and this has been The Point.